Richmond, California, January 1943. The dawn air trembles with the roar of steel and flame. Sparks cascade like falling stars as thousands of welders, riveters, and machinists swarm the decks of a half-finished ship. The smell of hot metal and oil mixes with the salty Pacific wind. Giant cranes swing massive steel plates into place, the final ribs of another Liberty ship rising from the earth. In the distance, fog drifts over the San Francisco Bay. Somewhere beyond that horizon, thousands of miles east, the Atlantic is a graveyard. Cargo ships burn on the water. Men cling to debris in the freezing dark. German U-boats, silent, unseen, slip beneath the waves, hunting the lifelines of the free world. Each day, Berlin's radio boasted new sinkings. Each night, Allied planners wondered if the ocean could ever be won. The math seemed impossible. Destroyers too few, merchant ships too slow, U-boats too deadly. But inside America's shipyards, something extraordinary was happening. Factories once meant for cars and bridges now birthed steel giants faster than anyone believed possible. Men and women worked without pause, day, night, and dawn again, hammering against time itself. By the time the Germans realized what was coming, it was already too late. Because somewhere amid the sparks and smoke, the United States had discovered a new kind of weapon, not of gunpowder or fire, but of speed. And soon, they would launch ships faster than the enemy could sink them. The sound of steel fades into the echo of waves, and the story of the Liberty ships begins. The Battle of the Atlantic, 1941–1942. Before the clang of shipyards and the thunder of industry, there was fear. Fear spread across the cold gray waters of the Atlantic, the vast, merciless expanse that linked the New World to the Old. Every ton of cargo that crossed it carried the fate of nations. Food for Britain, oil for its tanks, ammunition for its soldiers, and hope for an entire world standing against tyranny. By 1941, Britain was nearly on its knees. German U-boats, the Unterseeboote, had turned the sea into a hunting ground. They moved silently, unseen, cutting through the dark currents like steel predators. Convoy after convoy fell victim. Torpedoes struck without warning. Explosions lit the night. The ocean swallowed men and cargo alike. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz watched the sinking reports with satisfaction. His Wolfpack strategy, groups of U-boats coordinating attacks under radio command, was working perfectly. Each Liberty lost meant not just a ship, but a week's food for a nation, or fuel for an entire armored division. Between June 1940 and December 1941, over 1,000 Allied merchant ships were sunk. By early 1942, the situation was catastrophic. The United Kingdom, isolated by geography, depended on imported supplies for survival. Without them, the war would have ended not by invasion, but by starvation. Then came Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag, the German assault on America's eastern coast. In the months following Pearl Harbor, as the United States reeled from Japan's attack, U-boats prowled within sight of American beaches. From Florida to New York, ships were torpedoed almost daily. Oil slicks washed ashore. Debris drifted into harbors. The glow of burning tankers lit the night sky. The Americans had been unprepared. Few convoys were organized, coastal lights remained on, and merchant ships sailed silhouetted against the moonlit skyline, easy prey for the waiting submarines. By the spring of 1942, it was clear the Allies were losing the war beneath the waves. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the problem in brutal clarity. It wasn't just about winning battles, it was about outlasting the enemy. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared. "For us, this is a war of factories, a war of workers, a war of machines." America's survival, and the world's, depended on production, but ships were slow to build. Traditional merchant vessels required months, even years, of careful construction. Skilled shipwrights, complex parts, and endless delays meant that by the time one freighter left the docks, several others had already been lost to U-boats. Britain's yards were bombed and overstretched. Canada was doing its best, yet the scale required was beyond imagination. What the Allies needed was a miracle of manufacturing, something fast, cheap, and endless. And in 1941, That miracle began to take shape. The idea started quietly. In a series of meetings within the United States Maritime Commission, an agency formed in 1936 to rebuild the American merchant marine, one proposal stood out: a standardized cargo ship, simple in design, built not for beauty or speed, but for mass production. A ship so basic that any yard anywhere could build it. The British had already experimented with such a concept, the Empire Liberty, and now America would take that idea further, turning it into an industrial revolution. The new ship was designated the EC2SC1, a dull technical code for what would become known simply as the Liberty Ship. 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, 10,000 tons of cargo. Top speed, just 11 knots. Unremarkable, almost ugly, but practical, strong, and most importantly, fast to build. It was not the speed on the water that mattered. It was the speed on the ground. The early versions were modest in number. In 1941, only a handful had been completed. The U-boats were still winning. But then, as America's war machine awakened after Pearl Harbor, the scale of production exploded. New shipyards were built across both coasts. In California, Oregon, Texas, Maine, and Virginia, entire cities seemed to rise overnight beside the sea. Men who had never seen a ship before became builders of fleets. Women, many working for the first time, became welders, riveters, and machinists. Every shipyard echoed with the rhythm of urgency: torchlight, hammering, steel. But progress was uneven. Some of the early Liberty ships cracked under strain, their hulls splitting in half during cold weather. The critics sneered. Cheap ships, they called them, tin cans. Yet the logic remained sound. Quantity would become quality. Even if some broke apart, the flood would continue. As one engineer famously remarked, "They're designed to last 5 years. We only need them for 5 months." It was a brutal calculus, but it worked. By late 1942, the United States was producing ships at a rate no nation had ever achieved. In a single month, more tonnage was launched than the entire German shipbuilding industry could manage in a year. The numbers defied belief. Dozens of vessels sliding into the water every week, each carrying the lifeblood of Allied resistance: food, weapons, vehicles, men. For Germany, this industrial avalanche was invisible at first. The U-boat fleet continued its attacks, confident in victory. Yet by winter the tide had begun to shift. Convoys were growing larger, escorts more numerous, losses fewer. In Berlin, Dönitz began to notice a new pattern. For every ship sunk, 2 more seemed to take its place. Something enormous was happening across the Atlantic. The Liberty ship had begun to change the course of the war, not through innovation in design, but through the power of speed and scale. It was the weapon of a new kind of warfare, industrial warfare. And in the heart of that revolution stood one man who refused to accept that shipbuilding had to be slow. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, a builder who had never built a ship before, yet would go on to redefine how the ocean was won. Henry John Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a dreamer with a stopwatch. Before the war, he had built highways, dams, and entire industrial towns. His name was already tied to the monumental: the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee, the Columbia Basin. Kaiser understood one principle above all: speed through organization. Where traditional shipyards saw complexity, he saw a production line. Where old engineers spoke of precision, he spoke of flow. In 1941, the U.S. Maritime Commission gave Kaiser his first shipyard contract. It was a gamble. His experience in shipbuilding was zero, but his vision to apply mass production techniques, the same methods used by automobile factories, was revolutionary. He didn't want to craft ships. He wanted to assemble them. Kaiser's team built the Richmond shipyards in California, 4 enormous facilities along the bay, each a living organism of steel and steam. Entire neighborhoods were constructed to house the flood of workers. Kaiser villages, with hospitals, childcare, and schools. He recruited from everywhere: farmers, miners, homemakers, African Americans from the South, immigrants, and women in unprecedented numbers. In these yards, hierarchy vanished under urgency. Kaiser's mantra was simple. If one man can do it in 10 days, 10 men can do it in one. The birth of the production line at sea traditional shipbuilding had always been a craft. Each hull was constructed in sequence, one ship, one slip, one team. Every bolt, beam, and plate had to be fitted by hand. It was slow, precise, and proud. But Kaiser and his engineers introduced a radical new idea: prefabrication. Instead of building the ship as one continuous body, they built it in pieces, dozens of massive prefabricated sections assembled elsewhere in the yard. The sections were then brought together like a three-dimensional puzzle. Welding replaced the traditional method of riveting, reducing both time and manpower. Each day, these yards became more efficient. Every hour shaved off the schedule was a small victory against Hitler. The first few Liberty ships took months to complete. 200 days, then 150, then 100, but soon, new records fell like dominoes. Shipyard teams competed fiercely. Pride spread like wildfire. In Portland, Oregon, a yard finished a Liberty in just 10 days. Then came a record that stunned the world. The Robert E. Peary, completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes. It wasn't merely an achievement of engineering. It was a declaration of intent. America had turned shipbuilding into a form of warfare, a workforce like none before. Behind every ship stood an army of workers, the true soldiers of the home front. By 1943, over 650,000 men and women were employed in shipyards nationwide. Many were women, mothers and wives who had never wielded a torch or hammer before the war. Newspapers called them Wendy the Welder and Rosie the Riveter. In overalls and bandanas, they worked through the night under floodlights, their faces glowing with sparks. In Richmond alone, the population exploded from 24,000 to over 100,000. Streets were crowded with buses carrying shift workers. Cafeterias served meals 24 hours a day. Hospitals ran nonstop. The rhythm of production was relentless and patriotic. Accidents were common, fatigue constant, yet morale soared. Workers knew the stakes. Every ship launched meant food for Britain, supplies for Russia, hope for soldiers overseas. A Liberty ship wasn't just steel, it was survival. Kaiser himself called his shipyards weapons of democracy. He introduced health care plans for his employees, a first of its kind in American industry, laying the foundation for modern worker insurance systems. His workers called him the man who never sleeps. He didn't. Neither did his shipyards. The design: simple, ugly, indestructible. The Liberty ship's design was utilitarian, almost crude. The hull was welded from pre-cut steel plates. The bridge and superstructure were boxy. The propulsion system, a single triple expansion steam engine, was old-fashioned even by 1930s standards. But that was the point. Every component could be built using existing tools and materials. A Liberty ship carried 9,000 tons of cargo, had a crew of about 40, and cost just under $2 million, far less than any comparable vessel. It could transport tanks, aircraft, food, ammunition, or even troops. And with every launch, it became a silent rebuke to German naval superiority. The U-boats could destroy ships, but they couldn't destroy momentum. Still, the program had flaws. Welding, while faster, was also brittle in cold water. Several ships, including the John P. Gaines, broke in half due to brittle fractures. The sight of a Liberty ship snapping in two on calm seas shocked engineers and the public alike. Investigations followed. Metallurgists, including women scientists like Constance Tipper at Cambridge, studied the failures. Solutions came: stronger steel, improved design, and the program pressed on. Setbacks didn't stop production. The war couldn't wait for perfection. The motto was simple: get it done. The industrial avalanche. By late 1942, the United States had become the greatest shipbuilding nation in human history. Each week, new Liberty ships slid into the water, 3, 5, 10 at a time. Shipyards worked in perfect coordination with railroads and steel mills across the continent. Steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Ohio, propellers from New York. all converging in coastal yards. The scale defied comprehension. 2,110 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945 average. Completion time, 42 days per ship. Peak output, 3 ships every 2 days. At the peak of the war, America produced more merchant shipping in a single year than Japan, and Germany combined during the entire conflict. For Hitler, the arithmetic turned grim. Each U-boat sank around 20 ships in its career. But Liberty ships were replacing them faster, exponentially faster. Even when losses spiked, the graph of production climbed higher still. For the first time, the Atlantic balance began to shift. The Allies could finally sustain the fight, moving troops, fuel, and equipment across the ocean faster than Germany could stop them. The invisible front, while American workers built ships, Allied sailors fought to keep them afloat. Convoy escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft formed steel shields around the slow-moving Liberties. Radar, sonar, and air cover began closing the deadly gap in mid-Atlantic routes. The once invincible U-boats found themselves hunted, but none of this would have been possible without the ships themselves. Without their constant stream of cargo, Britain would have fallen, the Soviet Union would have starved, and the invasion of Europe would have remained impossible. Every Liberty ship launched was a small victory, a heartbeat of hope in a war of exhaustion. And as 1943 dawned, the Germans began to realize the truth. Their submarines could not sink. The ocean itself had become America's factory floor, a conveyor belt of steel and defiance stretching from the shipyards of California to the docks of Liverpool and Murmansk. The industrial miracle had begun to change not only the war, but the meaning of warfare itself. As the Liberty ships multiplied, so did their stories, of the people who built them, sailed them, and fought to protect them. To understand their impact, we must look closer at the many angles of this phenomenon: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. Each one reveals how ordinary people and simple designs reshaped the balance of the greatest war in history. The human angle, the builders of democracy. They came from every corner of America, men and women, young and old, farmers, teachers, miners, mechanics. Some had never seen the ocean before. Others had lost brothers or sons to it. They arrived at the shipyards carrying lunch pails and determination. In Richmond, Portland, Mobile, and Baltimore, the rhythm of the war was measured not by gunfire, but by the pounding of hammers and the hiss of torches. Every clang echoed across the yards like a drumbeat of resistance. They worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, driven not by orders but by purpose. Many were women. Over 250,000 by 1943. Wendy the welder, the female counterpart to Rosie the riveter, became an icon of American endurance. Dressed in denim overalls and leather gloves, faces streaked with soot, they learned the art of steel, how to cut, weld, and seal the bones of ships bound for war. They were mothers, sisters, wives, but on the assembly line, they were soldiers. Inside Kaiser's yards, diversity became strength. African Americans, Mexican Americans, immigrants from Italy and Poland, people who had once been divided by race or class, now stood shoulder to shoulder under the same burning sparks. For many, it was their first experience working alongside different backgrounds as equals. The shipyards became a social experiment wrapped in urgency. Racism, though not erased, was overshadowed by necessity. "A ship doesn't care what color your hands are," one welder remarked. "It only cares that you make it float." Every rivet driven was a small act of defiance against fascism. The life of a yard to understand the Liberty ship phenomenon. One must imagine the atmosphere inside a wartime shipyard. The noise was overwhelming. Steel plates crashed into place with thunderous resonance. The air was thick with smoke and salt. Sparks rained down from scaffolds 20 stories high. Everywhere, motion, cranes swinging, forklifts hauling, sirens signaling another hull complete. At night, the entire landscape glowed orange, as if the earth itself were on fire. The yards ran around the clock, shifts overlapping in a blur of labor and light. Music blared from loudspeakers. Cafeterias poured coffee by the gallon. Even as fatigue crept in, Morale remained unbroken. Every completion ceremony, every ship sliding down the ways into the sea, felt like a battle won. Kaiser's innovation wasn't just technical, it was psychological. He understood that morale was a form of energy. He made ship launches into public celebrations. Bands played. Families gathered. Champagne smashed against steel bows. Each christening reminded the workers that their effort was part of something vast and righteous. For a nation that had been attacked at Pearl Harbor, every launch was vengeance, quiet, determined vengeance. The engineering angle, simplicity is power. The Liberty ship's greatest strength was its simplicity. It was the first vessel designed to be built not by craftsmen, but by factories. At its core, the EC-2 SC-1 class was a blueprint for speed. The ship's hull consisted of pre-cut steel panels, each numbered, each fabricated at separate facilities, and then transported to the yard for assembly. Welding replaced riveting, cutting construction time by half. Instead of complex curves, designers favored straight lines and flat joints. Even the engines were standardized, allowing identical parts to fit any ship in the fleet. The genius wasn't in innovation, but in elimination. Every unnecessary detail was stripped away. The result was a ship that could be built by people who had never built one before. Henry Kaiser's yards were laboratories of motion. Components were built on parallel lines, the bow section in one area, the stern in another, the midships elsewhere. When ready, cranes lifted and fitted the pieces together with surgical precision. The process was chaotic, yet choreographed, a ballet of steel and smoke. This assembly line model transformed shipbuilding forever. What Ford had done for cars, Kaiser did for ships, solving the welding problem, but innovation came with risk. Riveting, though slow, had flexibility. It allowed metal to absorb stress. Welding, faster but rigid, created weak points under extreme temperature shifts. In 1943, disaster struck when several Liberty ships broke apart without warning. The John P. Gaines sank off Alaska after its hull fractured cleanly in two. Investigations uncovered a chilling truth. The steel used became brittle in cold water, and weld seams magnified the stress. Critics demanded the program be halted, but the war would not wait. Teams of engineers, including the British metallurgist Constance Tipper, raced to find the cause. They discovered that impurities in the steel and sharp corners in design created stress concentrators. The solution was straightforward: improve steel quality, smooth out the corners, and alter welding techniques. The results were immediate. Later Liberty ships proved far sturdier. Though a handful still fractured, the lessons learned reshaped marine engineering permanently. By 1944, the problem was largely solved. Another example of wartime pressure accelerating technological evolution. The numbers behind the miracle: each Liberty ship required roughly 3,400 tons of steel, 8,000 pipes, and 250,000 individual parts. In earlier times, assembling such complexity would take half a year. Under the new system, it took 6 weeks, sometimes less. At the height of production, the United States was launching 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. By the end of 1943, the fleet numbered over 1,200, more than enough to sustain the Allied advance into North Africa and prepare for the eventual invasion of Europe. To the untrained eye, Liberty ships looked clumsy, even archaic, slow-moving silhouettes against the waves. But they carried victory in their holds. Tanks for Patton, rations for the British Eighth Army, fuel for Soviet T-34s, and ammunition for island-hopping Marines in the Pacific, all flowed through Liberty ship convoys. Every ship was a promise that democracy would not starve. The human cost of speed progress had a price. Shipyard work was dangerous. Falls from scaffolds, explosions, and burns were frequent. The relentless pace took its toll. Many workers suffered hearing loss or chronic injuries. Fatigue caused errors. Errors could cost lives. But in the minds of those workers, every scar was worth it. "I can't fight with a rifle," one woman welder said, "but I can fight with this torch." The war blurred the lines between front and home. For the first time, civilians felt directly connected to victory, not through slogans, but through sweat. The Liberty Ship program turned ordinary citizens into participants in the greatest conflict in human history. And as the sparks rained down, they built more than ships. They built unity, courage, and the belief that industry itself could be a weapon. The clang of construction fades. On the Atlantic, Liberty ships now move in convoys. Endless lines of gray hulls stretching from horizon to horizon, each one built by unseen hands, carrying unseen hopes. But the battle was far from over. To understand how these ships changed the war itself, we must turn to the next layer of the story, the tactical and psychological dimensions that would leave Germany stunned. The tactical angle, the ships that fed. The war the Liberty ship was not glamorous. It wasn't designed to outrun torpedoes or withstand shellfire. It was slow, 11 knots at best, and its defensive armament was modest. A few 3-inch or 5-inch guns manned by the Navy Armed Guard. But its tactical purpose was never to fight. It was to endure. The Atlantic, stretching from North America to Britain, was the longest and most vital supply line in the world. Whoever controlled it would control the war. In 1941 and early 1942, Germany's U-boats dominated it entirely. Allied convoys were shredded. Supply losses soared. Britain's survival depended on tonnage. Food, oil, ammunition, and weapons crossing the sea faster than they were lost. Before the Liberty ship, that equation was bleak. The British and Canadians simply could not replace their losses. Merchant ships took too long to build, and each convoy lost weakened their ability to feed and arm their people. Then came the flood. By mid-1943, Liberty ships began to fill the Atlantic in staggering numbers. Entire convoys, sometimes over 100 ships, steamed together, each loaded with thousands of tons of cargo. Their mission? Keep the arteries of the free world open. Tactically, this changed everything. Each convoy acted as a moving fortress. Destroyer escorts, corvettes, and aircraft patrolled its perimeter, guided by newly developed ASDIC sonar and airborne radar. Long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator could now close the mid-Atlantic gap, the once unreachable zone where U-boats had hunted without fear. With Liberty ships at their core, the convoys became unbreakable. The slow, gray hulls marched eastward like an iron procession. Even when torpedoes struck, replacements followed almost immediately. The Allied command, for the first time, could plan offensives with confidence, knowing that their supply lines were secure. Turning the tide by the spring of 1943, the German U-boat fleet reached its zenith, over 400 submarines operating in the Atlantic. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed victory was near. His wolf packs launched coordinated attacks against convoy ONS-5 in May, a battle that became the turning point of the entire Atlantic campaign. The convoy consisted largely of Liberty ships, slow, heavy, and vulnerable. 43 merchant vessels escorted by a handful of destroyers faced an onslaught of nearly 40 U-boats. For days, explosions thundered across the waves. Torpedoes struck. Ships burned. Men screamed for help in the freezing water. But this time, the Allies struck back. Improved sonar, radar, and high-frequency direction finding, known as Huff-Duff, revealed U-boat positions. Allied aircraft appeared unexpectedly, dropping depth charges from above. Within a week, 6 U-boats were destroyed and several more crippled. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. And through the chaos, the Liberty ships kept sailing. Some damaged, some limping, but they arrived. Their cargoes reached Britain. The balance of the war shifted not with a single battle, but with a single truth. Germany could no longer sink ships faster than America could build them. From that point forward, the U-boat campaign collapsed into defense. The Liberty ship's tactical reach, the Liberty ship's impact extended far beyond the Atlantic. In the Arctic convoys, They braved ice and darkness to deliver supplies to the Soviet Union, through the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. In the Mediterranean, they supported the Allied invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, unloading tanks, fuel, and ammunition onto beaches under fire. In the Pacific, they supplied the leapfrogging island campaigns that brought U.S. forces closer to Japan. Each region of war had its dangers: submarines, aircraft, mines, but the Liberty ships endured all of them. They became the logistical backbone of the Allied war effort, transforming industrial output into tactical advantage. The Liberty ship didn't just carry cargo, it carried momentum. Every ton of steel and grain it delivered meant a tank that rolled, a bomber that flew, a soldier who ate. Without them, D-Day would have been impossible. Without them, the Soviet front might have collapsed. Without them, the war could have dragged on for years. By 1944, the equation had reversed completely. The Allies had ships to spare. Convoys crossed the Atlantic faster, larger, safer. The ocean that once belonged to Germany had become a conveyor belt of Allied power. The psychological angle. Germany's shock in Berlin. Disbelief turned to frustration. Admiral Dönitz had built his naval strategy around mathematics. The assumption that Germany could sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could replace them. It was a cold, efficient calculation. But the Liberty ship program shattered that logic. Every time a U-boat sent a freighter to the bottom, the Americans launched 2 more. Propaganda could not conceal the numbers. By late 1943, Allied shipping losses had fallen by over 70%, while German submarine losses tripled. Reports from U-boat captains spoke of despair. "Convoys are endless," one wrote. "We strike one, and another appears behind it. The ocean is full of them." Even Goebbels' propaganda ministry struggled to explain the shift. In private memos, officials admitted that the Allied shipbuilding program was beyond comprehension. Nazi Germany, for all its engineering brilliance, could not match the sheer industrial weight of a democracy in motion. For every ton of steel Germany forged into tanks and guns, America forged it into ships, ships that fed, moved, and armed an entire global alliance. The morale of the builders back in America. News of the production miracles spread quickly. Newspapers printed photographs of record-breaking launches, headlines boasting, "Ship built in 4 days." Radio broadcasts played interviews with welders and foremen. The effect on morale was profound. The Liberty ship became a symbol of what ordinary people could achieve when united by purpose. At a time when millions of families had sons fighting overseas, the shipyards became a second battlefield, one where mothers and fathers could fight their own war. The launch of each vessel was celebrated with music and parades. Bottles of champagne shattered against steel bows as children watched their parents' labor slide proudly into the sea. These moments built something deeper than steel. They built belief. Belief that democracy, though slower to awaken, was unstoppable once it did. The morale of the enemy, for the Germans, morale began to fracture. The once invincible gray wolves of the Atlantic, the U-boats, became symbols of futility. By mid-1943, submarine crews faced terrifying odds. Depth charges rained from the skies, sonar pings haunted the depths, and supply lines to the U-boat pens in France grew desperate. The average lifespan of a German submarine crew dropped to just 5 patrols. Captured U-boat sailors spoke of exhaustion and hopelessness. One survivor recalled, "We were told the Americans were decadent, lazy, soft, but they built ships like machines, build bullets." It never ended. The psychological war was over long before the naval one ended. The German Navy had no counter for a nation that could outproduce them tenfold. The symbolism of speed became more than a number. It became an ideology. The Liberty ship embodied America's belief that technology and willpower could overcome any force. It wasn't elegant or perfect. It was effective. Every ship that slid into the sea carried a silent message to the Axis powers. We can replace everything you destroy. In total, 2,110 Liberty ships would be completed by 1945, more than any class of ship ever built in human history. Each one stood as a symbol of endurance over destruction, unity over fear. Even the name, Liberty, was deliberate. It turned an object of steel into a statement of purpose. In the words of Franklin D. Roosevelt, "The shipyards of America are the proving grounds of freedom." And they were. The convoys now filled the Atlantic horizon, endless, gray, unstoppable. What had begun as desperation was now domination. But the true test of the Liberty ship was still to come. In 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its breaking point, and the Germans realized that the ocean itself had turned against them. The winter of 1943. The Atlantic at its deadliest, the North Atlantic, early 1943. A world of ice and steel. The ocean boiled under the bitter winter winds. Convoys moved through the storm. Slow, creaking, but relentless. Among them sailed convoy SC-118, bound for Britain with 63 merchant ships. Many were Liberty-class vessels, new, untested, fresh from the shipyards of Baltimore and Portland. Their decks were slick with frost, their gun crews shivering under gray tarps. Above them, the sky was a ceiling of clouds, heavy, silent, watchful. Beneath, in the blackness of the sea, waited the wolves. For the German Navy, this was meant to be the decisive winter. The Kriegsmarine had doubled down on the U-boat campaign. Admiral Dönitz had deployed hundreds of submarines across the North Atlantic, hunting not for individual ships, but for the convoys that sustained the Allied war machine. Each wolf pack was a network of killers, coordinated by encrypted radio signals, striking in groups of 10, 20, sometimes 40 submarines at once. Their goal was simple: to starve Britain into submission before American production could tip the scales. And, for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed possible. Between January and March 1943, U-boats sent over 300 Allied ships to the bottom. Tankers, freighters, troop ships. More than 20,000 sailors lost their lives in those months alone. The Atlantic became a graveyard of twisted hulls and oil-slicked waves. But behind the tragedy, something had changed. The Liberty ship program was no longer a promise. It was a flood. The tonnage war turns in Washington, D.C. Shipping records revealed a stunning statistic. In a single month, March 1943, U-boats had sunk roughly 600,000 tons of Allied shipping. But in that same month, Liberty shipyards launched over 700,000 tons of new ships. For the first time in the war, construction had outpaced destruction. It wasn't victory yet, not on the seas, not in the convoys, but it was the moment the tide began to shift. The Allies could finally afford losses. The machine could feed itself. Each Liberty ship launched in March replaced the one lost in February. The industrial rhythm of America was faster than the torpedoes of Germany. Still, the U-boats were not finished. The Battle of Convoy ONS-5. In late April 1943, a convoy of 43 merchant ships left Liverpool for Halifax, designated ONS-5. It was a return voyage, carrying ballast, a few empty tankers, and several Liberty ships headed back to American ports for new cargoes. Escorting them were a handful of British and Canadian destroyers, corvettes, and a few armed trawlers. The convoy sailed straight into the heart of a U-boat ambush. Dönitz had assembled over 40 submarines to intercept them. The battle began on April 29th and raged for a full week across the freezing Atlantic. At night, the sky was lit with flames as torpedoes struck and ships exploded. Liberty ships like SS Penalver and SS Harbury fought for survival. their crews firing back with 20mm Oerlikon guns. The sea churned with burning oil and wreckage. But something extraordinary happened that week. The escorts didn't retreat. The convoy didn't scatter. Instead, they fought back with a ferocity the U-boats had never faced before. Using new 10-centimeter radar, the Allied destroyers could detect submarines even through fog and darkness. Depth charges fell in patterns, scientific, precise, devastating. In one 24-hour period, 5 U-boats were sunk. Others were crippled, forced to surface, and destroyed by aircraft. The hunters had become prey. When ONS-5 finally reached Halifax on May 5th, 13th merchant ships had been lost, but the Germans had lost 6 U-boats, with many more damaged beyond repair. For the first time, the U-boat fleet had suffered greater losses than the Allies in a single convoy battle. It was the breaking point of the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz's nightmare. When Admiral Karl Dönitz received the reports, he knew what it meant. His U-boat arm, once the pride of Germany's navy, had reached its limit. In May 1943, Germany lost 41 submarines, a third of its operational fleet, in a single month. That loss rate was unsustainable. The oceans that had once seemed endless now felt small, suffocating. Allied aircraft ranged farther than ever before, equipped with radar and depth charges. Convoys grew tighter, faster, more disciplined. The Liberty ships, once easy prey, now sailed surrounded by steel guardians. In a single meeting at his headquarters in Paris, Dönitz made the most painful decision of his career. He ordered the withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic. For the German Navy, it was the end of the offensive war. The Liberty convoys ascendant. When the U-boats retreated, the Atlantic breathed again. Convoys doubled in size. Allied war planners in London and Washington realized they now possessed a weapon of unmatched power. Not a bomb, not a gun, but a continuous flow of men and material that could cross any ocean. Each Liberty ship became a cell in the bloodstream of a global army. By the summer of 1943, these convoys carried over 10 million tons of cargo each month, thousands of tanks and vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, and enough food to feed entire nations. Where Germany's strategy relied on destruction, America's relied on renewal. Every loss was simply a prelude to the next launch. In war, that kind of resilience is invincible. The turning of the tide. By June 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. U-boats would still hunt. Convoys would still lose ships. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The ocean had changed allegiance. German sailors began referring to it bitterly as Die Schwarze Grube, the Black Pit. It was no longer a hunting ground, but a grave. In London, Winston Churchill, who had once called the U-boat threat the only thing that ever really frightened me, finally allowed himself a smile. The lifeline to America was secure. Britain would not starve. The Allied armies would be fed, armed, and ready for the invasion of Europe. Behind that turning point lay a single truth. A nation that could build faster than its enemy could destroy would always win. The Liberty ship had proven it. The human side of victory in. The shipyards, the workers knew little of the specifics. They only knew that their ships were reaching Britain and that the convoys were holding. When news spread of the U-boat withdrawal, celebration rippled through the factories. In Portland, sirens wailed not for shift changes, but for victory. In Baltimore, workers cheered as a banner was hung across the hull of a new Liberty ship. This one's for ONS-5. Each rivet hammered, each weld laid down, now carried a deeper meaning. The shipbuilders weren't just creating transport vessels anymore. They were building symbols of survival, and the ocean that had once swallowed so many lives had finally been forced to give way. The Battle of the Reedy. Atlantic was turning, but the war itself was far from over. The Liberty ship, now proven, would be called upon again to carry the invasion forces that would storm the beaches of Normandy, to feed armies across continents, and to define the final phase of the Allied offensive. Its greatest test, and its greatest legacy, still lay ahead. By late 1943, the Allies no longer feared the Atlantic. The ocean that had once been a corridor of death was now a highway of victory. The Liberty ships, which had begun as a desperate experiment, were now the foundation of global logistics. With the U-boat threat suppressed, Allied planners in Washington and London shifted focus. Their gaze turned toward the next great challenge: the invasion of Fortress Europe. For years, the British Isles had been a fortress of endurance, surviving on convoys that bled through the blockade. Now, it would become the launch point of liberation. To make that possible, the Allies would need to move an unimaginable weight of material. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, rations, ammunition, everything an army could consume. And there was only one vessel in the world capable of carrying it in such scale: the Liberty ship. The Great Build-Up. Operation Bolero. The operation to prepare for the invasion of Europe was codenamed Bolero. It began in earnest in 1943, even before the Battle of the Atlantic was fully won. Its purpose: to transport an entire American army across the ocean and keep it supplied for months of fighting. It was a logistical undertaking unlike anything in history. More than 1 million American troops, with all their vehicles and equipment, had to be moved to Britain in secret, sustained by a constant flow of supplies. The task required thousands of voyages, most of them carried out by Liberty ships. Each ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo: food, munitions, medical supplies, jeeps, fuel. Convoys arrived almost daily at ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow. British dock workers and American soldiers labored side by side, unloading the endless stream of materiel. In London, Allied command centers tracked every ton. Charts filled with red and blue lines showed the transatlantic rhythm. Ships leaving New York, Halifax, Boston, and arriving in Britain days later, forming a living chain that pulsed with the heartbeat of war. By the end of 1943, Bolero had delivered over 3 million tons of supplies and nearly 1 million men. The ocean had become a bridge. The Liberty ship as a weapon of liberation, though unarmed and unglamorous, the Liberty ship had become a weapon, not of destruction, but of mobility. Each one delivered the means to fight. In North Africa, Liberty ships landed supplies for Montgomery's 8th Army during the push toward Tunisia. In Italy, they brought Sherman tanks to support the brutal fighting at Anzio. And in the Pacific, they delivered the island-hopping arsenals that brought U.S. Marines closer to Japan. But Europe remained the heart of the war. By 1944, every port in southern England was packed with Liberty ships, offloading cargo under blackout conditions. The docks of Southampton, Portsmouth, and Plymouth became vast warehouses of steel. Mountains of crates, barrels, and vehicles stretched as far as the eye could see. Soldiers nicknamed it the Great Pile. They didn't yet know that the supplies around them would soon fuel the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Operation Overlord. D-Day's lifeline, June 6, 1944. D-Day. As the first assault waves stormed the beaches of Normandy, a vast fleet waited behind them. Not destroyers or battleships, but Liberty ships. Each one was packed with everything the soldiers on the beaches would need to survive and advance: ammunition, rations, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, even prefabricated bridges and bulldozers. Over 2,500 ships supported the Normandy landings, and Liberty ships made up nearly a third of them. Some were converted into floating repair depots. Others became hospital ships, filled with wounded men evacuated from the beaches. Many served as supply carriers, unloading directly onto the temporary harbors known as mulberries, built from sunken ships and steel pontoons. One Liberty ship, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, would later become one of the last surviving vessels from that armada. A living relic of the day, freedom came ashore. Without the Liberty ship, D-Day would have been impossible. The Allied invasion didn't just rely on courage or strategy. It relied on the steady pulse of ships crossing the channel, replenishing the front line hour after hour. The German collapse as 1944 progressed. The Liberty ship's presence became an omen to German troops and civilians alike. Every port seized by the Allies was soon filled with them, unloading food, fuel, and weapons. In France, they brought the supplies that fed Patton's Third Army as it raced across the countryside. In Belgium, they carried the fuel that powered the Allied advance toward the Rhine. In Italy, they delivered the goods that kept the fighting going in the mountains and valleys. For Germany, it was a nightmare of scale. No matter how many bridges the Luftwaffe bombed, how many trains the Wehrmacht sabotaged, the Liberty convoys never stopped. The ships symbolized the one thing Germany could not match: production. By late 1944, the Allies had built over 2,300 Liberty ships. Germany, under constant bombardment, could barely produce enough U-boats to replace its losses. The industrial race was over. When American tanks rolled into Paris, they were fueled by oil from Liberty ships. When Allied bombers pounded German cities, their bombs had crossed the Atlantic in Liberty holds. When the starving citizens of Europe were fed, their food came from the same source. The Liberty ship had become a quiet conqueror. Faceless, tireless, everywhere. The frozen front. Liberty ships in the Arctic, even in the war's coldest reaches. They carried on. The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union, codenamed PQ and JW, were among the most dangerous missions of the war. Ships sailed from Scotland through the Norwegian Sea, past the North Cape to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, under constant threat from German bombers and submarines. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees. Decks turned to glass. Men froze to death at their posts. Yet, Liberty ships went anyway. Of the 811 merchant ships that made the journey to the USSR, over 150 were Liberty class. They carried tanks, trucks, raw materials, everything Stalin's armies needed to keep advancing westward. The cost was horrific. Over 100 ships were lost to air raids, torpedoes, and ice. But for every one sunk, 2 more replaced it. In a speech in Moscow, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin acknowledged this unseen army of steel, calling the American shipbuilders the second front of the war. The Liberty ship, though silent and slow, was part of every victory, from Normandy to Stalingrad, from the Pacific to the Arctic Circle. The machine that won the world. By the beginning of 1945, the war's outcome was inevitable. The Allies advanced on all fronts, powered by the unstoppable rhythm of transatlantic convoys. Every day, dozens of Liberty ships arrived in Europe and Asia, sustaining armies of millions. The oceans no longer belonged to any nation. They belonged to the system of production that could never be stopped. The German Navy, broken and outmatched, could do nothing. The once feared wolf packs had been reduced to isolated survivors. Their war had ended long before Germany surrendered. In Berlin's ruins, Allied officers later found Dönitz's wartime notes. In one entry, written during the dark days of 1943, he had scrawled a single sentence: "The enemy's shipbuilding capacity is beyond comprehension." The Atlantic is lost. He was right. The Liberty ship had not only turned the tide of the war, it had redefined warfare itself. No longer would victory depend solely on generals or weapons. It would depend on who could sustain the fight longest, who could feed, build, and transport faster than the other side could destroy. And in that kind of war, the Liberty ship was king. By 1945, the last convoys crossed the Atlantic not for battle, but for rebuilding. The war that began in fear ended in abundance. The ships that had once carried destruction now carried relief, food, medicine, and hope to a world in ashes. But the story of the Liberty ship did not end there. Its steel hulls would sail for decades after the war, carrying peace instead of war. And its legacy, industrial, human, and moral, would define the very idea of modern logistics. The ocean was no longer a frontier of fear. It was a bridge, built by liberty itself. Victory at Sea, May 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Atlantic, once littered with burning ships and oil slicks, was calm again. The convoys that had once fought their way through storms and torpedoes now steamed peacefully toward European ports, carrying not weapons, but food. And everywhere there were Liberty ships. They sailed into Cherbourg and Le Havre, into Rotterdam and Antwerp, into the shattered docks of Hamburg and Bremen. The same steel hulls that once braved the Atlantic's fury now carried wheat, medical supplies, and coal for the survivors of war. Their decks, once guarded by Navy gunners, now held crates stamped with new labels: UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Their mission had changed, but their purpose remained the same: to sustain life where it had been destroyed. In just 4 years, the Liberty ship had gone from a desperate wartime improvisation to the backbone of global recovery. The numbers that stunned the world. When the final tallies were made, the figures seemed impossible. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards had produced 2,710 Liberty ships, more vessels than any other class in history. Together, they carried over 150 million tons of cargo across every ocean on Earth. They delivered 1/3 of all supplies transported by Allied forces during the war and, perhaps most remarkably, despite the relentless U-boat campaign, over 85% of all Liberty ships built survived the war. Each one had been assembled from 250,000 individual parts, standardized across 18 shipyards, using over 7,000 tons of steel in total. To the German High Command, those numbers were catastrophic. To the Allied world, they were miraculous, even years after the war. Analysts studying production statistics agreed on a single truth: the Liberty ship was the turning point in industrial warfare. It had proven that logistics, not firepower, not technology, but logistics, could decide the fate of nations. The quiet legacy of the workers in the victory parades that followed, soldiers marched, pilots saluted, and generals gave speeches. But in the shipyards, celebration was quieter and more personal. Men and women stood beside the empty berths where once the Liberty hulls had risen. Welders wiped their hands on their overalls, riveters hugged their children, and the whistles that had once signaled danger now blew for peace. In the Richmond Yard, a final ceremony was held. Workers gathered as the last Liberty ship, the SS Albert M. Bow, slid into the water in September 1945. There was no orchestra, no military fanfare, just the sound of waves against steel and the cheers of tired, proud men and women. It was the end of an era and the beginning of something new. Those who had built the ships understood something few others did. Victory hadn't come from miracles or luck. It had come from labor, from hands that welded, riveted, and lifted, from men and women who had turned fear into resolve, and resolve into ships. The fate of the Liberty fleet when the war ended. The oceans were crowded. The world no longer needed thousands of cargo ships, yet they couldn't simply be abandoned. Some Liberty ships continued in service, hauling goods in peacetime commerce. They carried grain from Canada, machinery from the United States, and refugees from war-torn Europe. Others were sold to private companies and renamed, their gray wartime paint stripped away, replaced with bright peacetime colors. Hundreds more were placed in mothball fleets, anchored quietly in bays and rivers from California to Virginia. They were kept in reserve, their holds sealed, their engines idle, waiting for the day they might be needed again. That day would come sooner than expected. In 1950, when war erupted again on the Korean Peninsula, the United States reactivated over 600 Liberty ships to supply the conflict. They carried ammunition and fuel to the Far East, just as they had to Europe a decade earlier. The Liberty ship had outlasted the war that created it. It had become a permanent instrument of global logistics, a workhorse of peace as much as of war. The economic aftershock, the legacy of the Liberty ship was not only military or industrial, it was economic. During the war, shipbuilding had employed over 1 million Americans across 18 major yards and dozens of smaller facilities. When the contracts ended, many feared mass unemployment. But the opposite happened. The skills learned during Liberty production, mass welding, modular assembly, quality control, became the foundation of post-war American manufacturing. Aircraft, automobiles, railways, and even housing. Adopted methods pioneered in the shipyards. Economists later called it the industrial democratization of America, the moment when the tools of war built the foundations of peace and the ripple spread beyond America. British, Canadian, and Australian shipyards copied the Liberty model, developing their own standardized merchant ships for the new global trade network that emerged after 1945. The Liberty ship had done more than win a war. It had redefined how the world built things. The human price, yet victory, had come at a cost. Nearly 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died in the Battle of the Atlantic, more than the total casualties of some entire armies. For them, there were few parades, few medals, and little recognition. The Liberty ships they manned had been essential, but invisible. They had no glory, only duty. In ports across America and Britain, memorials were later raised in their honor, statues of sailors standing watch, bronze plaques inscribed with the names of ships that never returned. The SS John Harvey, destroyed in Bari. The SS Samuel Heintzelman, lost to a torpedo in the Indian Ocean. The SS Daniel Morgan, gone without a trace off Iceland. Their crews became the silent heroes of a global struggle. Ordinary men who faced extraordinary danger for the sake of supply. As one British merchant sailor later wrote in his diary, "We did not fight the enemy. We fought the ocean, the fear, and the odds, and we won." A global transformation by 1946, the Liberty ship had done something no weapon ever could. It had connected the world. Ports once shattered by bombs were rebuilt with materials delivered by Liberty hulls. Nations once divided by war were linked again by trade routes first charted by those convoys. In many ways, the post-war order, the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the global economy began not in boardrooms or treaties, but in shipyards. The Liberty ship had proven that industrial unity could defend freedom and then rebuild it. But as the peace settled, a new question emerged. What would happen to these ships, these steel ghosts of war, as time passed and memory faded? Would they be forgotten? Or would they endure, like the ideals they carried across the seas. The rusting giants by the 1950s, the world had moved on. The Liberty ships, once the symbol of wartime urgency, now rested silently in harbors across the United States. Lines of steel hulls stretching into the horizon. Anchored in the still waters of Suisun Bay, California, and the James River Reserve Fleet in Virginia, they sat shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of them, gray paint fading, decks streaked with rust, their names slowly vanishing beneath years of wind and salt. Children in nearby towns would look out across the water and ask their parents what those ships were, and the parents would answer with quiet pride, they were the ships that won the war. To sailors and shipbuilders, the sight was bittersweet. Each vessel represented not just steel, but memory, of danger, of labor, of purpose. But time, as always, was relentless. Steel decays, paint peels, and even legends must face the sea again, one last time. The final voyages by the 1960s, commercial shipping had changed. New tankers and freighters, faster and larger, made the old liberties obsolete. Their steam engines, once the heartbeat of Allied logistics, were now antiques. One by one, the remaining ships were sold for scrap. In shipbreaking yards from Baltimore to Bombay, torches cut through the hulls that had once defied torpedoes. The sound of steel being torn apart echoed like distant thunder. The final act of an industrial age. Some were converted into storage hulks or floating warehouses. A few became training ships or power barges, but most met the same fate, dismantled, melted down, and reborn as the raw materials of a new world. By the early 1970s, fewer than 100 Liberty ships remained afloat, and yet, not all were lost. The ships that wouldn't die, handful of Liberty ships survived. Not by chance, but because people refused to forget. In Baltimore, the SS John W. Brown was saved from scrapping by a group of former shipyard workers and maritime enthusiasts. Painstakingly restored over decades, she once again sailed under her own power. Not for war, but for remembrance. In San Francisco, another, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, was rescued from the Suisun Bay Reserve Fleet. Volunteers cleaned her hull, restored her engine room, and repainted her decks until she gleamed as she had in 1944. When she finally steamed under the Golden Gate Bridge once more, her whistle echoing across the bay, thousands watched from the shore. Some wept, others saluted. 50 years after she was built, the Jeremiah O'Brien crossed the Atlantic again in 1994, the only operational Liberty ship to return to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. As her crew stood on deck, passing the beaches where thousands had died, silence fell. Then softly, the ship's whistle sounded. A single, haunting note carried by the wind. The past, it seemed, had come home. The forgotten heroes remembered in the decades that followed. Museums and memorials began to tell their stories, not just of the ships, but of the people behind them. In Richmond, California, the former Kaiser shipyard became the Rosie the Riveter, World War II Homefront National Historical Park, honoring the women who had built those ships at unprecedented speed. Visitors walk through preserved warehouses and workshops, hearing the clang of hammers and the hum of engines recreated through sound design. The names of welders, riveters, and draftsmen, once lost in records, are now etched in plaques and walls. At sea, Liberty ship veterans gathered for reunions. Men now gray and stooped shared photographs from convoys long gone. They told stories of nights spent in blackout, of fires on deck, of friendships forged in fear. And through those stories, something remarkable happened. History became personal again. Legacy in iron and spirit. The Liberty ship's legacy is not measured in tonnage or blueprints, but in transformation. Before 1941, no nation had ever attempted industrial mobilization on such a scale. After 1945, no modern war or reconstruction effort could happen without it. The modular design principles, the assembly line efficiency, the logistics coordination, all became permanent fixtures of global industry. Even NASA engineers, decades later, cited Liberty ship production as an early example of how to manage massive, multi-site engineering projects. But beyond innovation, the ships left something deeper. A philosophy. That ordinary people, when united by purpose, could achieve the impossible. The Liberty ship was never beautiful. She was not fast, nor graceful. But she was enough, strong enough, big enough, quick enough to matter. And that, more than anything, was her genius. The rust and the memory today. If you visit the harbors of Baltimore or San Francisco, you can still hear the echo. The Jeremiah O'Brien still sails, her engines thundering with the same rhythm they did in 1944, powered by steam, maintained by volunteers who weren't even born when she first launched. The John W. Brown still floats, a living museum that carries veterans, students, and dreamers across calm waters that once ran red with war. When the boilers fire, the ship's hull shivers, and the smell of oil and steel fills the air. The past feels close again, alive beneath your feet. Standing on her deck, you can almost hear it, the distant hum of the shipyards, the hammering of rivets, the whistle of cranes, the chorus of workers shouting across steel. For a moment, history breathes. The immortal fleet, most of the Liberty ships, are gone now, dissolved into the world they helped build. Their steel may live on in bridges, cars, or skyscrapers. Silent fragments of history, woven into the fabric of the modern world. But their story endures wherever freedom and industry meet. In every cargo ship that crosses the ocean, in every factory that transforms chaos into order, in every nation rebuilt from ruin, there is a trace of the Liberty ship's soul. It is the soul of urgency, of unity, of defiance. A reminder that when the world stood on the edge of darkness, humanity built light out of iron, sweat, and time. Closing lines. Transition to epilogue. When the last of the Liberty ships disappears beneath the waves, when rust and tide reclaim what men once forged, their echo will remain because they were more than ships. They were the sound of hope made of steel. And even now, if you listen to the wind on the open sea, you might still hear it, the heartbeat of the fleet that saved the world. The Liberty ship was never meant to be remembered. She was designed to serve briefly, to move cargo from one shore to another, and then to vanish into the statistics of war. Yet history remembers her still, not because of beauty or brilliance, but because she proved something greater than steel could hold. She proved that courage can be built, not just felt. That determination can take shape in iron and steam, and that when ordinary hands unite, they can move the machinery of destiny itself. In the dark years of the early 1940s, when democracies trembled and empires seemed invincible, the Liberty ship became a quiet rebellion against despair. She was the embodiment of the idea that freedom, if it could not be defended by soldiers alone, could be manufactured in yards, in factories, in the sweat of people who refused to surrender. Each plate welded, each rivet hammered, was a declaration. We will not be broken. The war ended. The factories fell silent. The workers returned to lives that would never again feel small. But something profound had changed. The world had learned that the power of nations no longer rested solely on generals and weapons, but on the will of ordinary citizens to build. In that sense, the Liberty ship was more than a vessel. She was a statement about humanity's dual nature, capable of destruction, yet equally capable of creation on a scale just as vast. For the Germans who tried to sink her, she became a symbol of futility, of a machine they could not stop. For the Americans and their allies, she became a floating promise, proof that the free world could outthink, outwork, and outlast tyranny. But beyond all strategy and production records, her legacy lies in the invisible, the spirit of resilience she left behind. Today, standing on the deck of a restored Liberty ship, it is hard not to feel small, and yet somehow part of something immense. You can run your hand along the cold railing and imagine the thousands who built her, the sailors who trusted her through storms and war, the welders who worked under floodlights until dawn. Each ship was a fragment of millions of lives briefly aligned toward one impossible goal. It is rare in history for such unity to exist, rarer still for it to endure. But the Liberty ships remind us that even the most ordinary of people, given purpose, can shape the tide of civilization. There is a quiet irony in their name, Liberty. They were not glamorous. They were not celebrated at first, but they carried freedom across oceans, silently and without complaint. And perhaps that is why their story still resonates. Because liberty itself, like the ships that bore its name, is not elegant. It is forged in heat and labor. It creaks and bends under strain. It must be built again and again by each generation that inherits its weight. When the last of them rusts away, the world will not lose her, because the lesson she taught remains, that the greatest victories are not always won in battle, but in the will to create what must exist. In the end, the Liberty ships did more than carry cargo. They carried the belief that humanity, even in its darkest hour, could rise through unity, through effort, through faith in work itself. They were the steel pulse of democracy, the industrial heartbeat that refused to stop. And though the tides will take them, the echo of their hammers, their engines, and their purpose will endure. In every bridge, every ship, every hand that builds against the storm. Because sometimes history is not written in words or weapons. Sometimes it's built, plate by plate, and it sails.